introduce my two good friends, Courtney M. Cox and Perry B. Johnson, who are scholars and authors and co-founders of The Sound of Victory, which is an interdisciplinary multi-platform project dedicated to investigating the deeply intertwined relationship between music, sound, and sport. And so their presentation today is titled "The Revolution Will Be Televised: Branded Resistance at the Super Bowl Halftime Show." And I'm so excited for this discussion that they're going to have with Joanna K. who's going to join them. So take it away, Perry and Courtney.
Hello, hello. Welcome so much. We are closing this thing out. There's been fantastic presentations throughout, so I hope we can live up to the amazing presentations before us. Thanks for everyone being here today, and to Andrew, to Dr. Shepard, to Hannah, to Alyssa, all the good folks at the James Lawson Institute for organizing and hosting the symposium. My name is Courtney M. Cox. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Oregon in the Department of Indigenous, Race, and Ethnic Studies. And in my work, I'm largely interested in issues of labor, identity, and technology through sport. New hotness dropping in a few days here. My first book, Double Crossover, Gender, Media, and Politics in Global Basketball. And along with Dr. Perry B. Johnson, I co-direct The Sound of Victory, as Andrew mentioned, an interdisciplinary multi-platform initiative dedicated to investigating the historical relationship between music, sound, and sport. We were obviously over here really giddy to hear about walk-up songs, to hear about the relationship in the previous panel to music, sound, and sport. Even the first panel, thinking about the controversies when music is brought into the sporting space. And so we hope to continue that in our talk today. Dr. Perry B. Johnson is a music scholar and cultural historian at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communication, and her primary research and practice focus on music, popular culture, and American cultural histories, with an emphasis on archives, public scholarship, power, identity, and belonging. She is at work on the manuscript for her first book, A Cultural History of Sexual Misconduct in America's Popular Music Industry. No shortage of content there for sure, and working to develop an accompanying digital database that captures and maps allegations and incidents of misconduct. She is the lead editor of a forthcoming edited collection titled The Sound of Victory: Music, Sport, and Society with NYU Press. And Dr. Joanna K. is an associate professor of music at the University of Richmond and the book reviews editor for the Journal of the Society for American Music. She researches American and popular music and multimedia and has published extensively on music and US national brand and political advertising. Her 2019 book, Soda Goes Pop, Pepsi Cola Advertising and Popular Music, was supported by an American Association of University Women's Fellowship, and her forthcoming co-edited interdisciplinary volume with Jesse Fillerup is titled Sonic Identity at the Margins. She's also working on an NEH-funded digital humanities project titled America's Music Scenes in the Age of Social Media with Andrew McGraw, and a book on music's role in NFL Super Bowl broadcast, which again gives me such great joy to have a chance to dig in with both of you today. So one of the things, as mentioned, as you may have seen here with the title, that we're really interested in is thinking through some of the cultural and commercial dynamics of the National Football League's annual Super Bowl championship, with a particular focus on the halftime show, as well as those pregame musical activities as sites of performance, consumption, and at times resistance. Between the three of us, we have books in progress on the topic of the Super Bowl, so it only felt right to be in dialogue to think through some of these ideas together out loud and in community with all of you. And central to this work has been a historical interrogation of what these musical spectacles tell us about culture, about politics, about society, and relatedly, an examination of the role advertising and brand partnerships play in the staging of these performances. And for Perry and I, as comm scholars, we take seriously Michael Reel's claim that the Super Bowl elevates one game to the level of spectacle of American ideology collectively celebrated. He writes that, quote, rather than mere diversionary entertainment, it can be seen to function as a propaganda vehicle, both strengthening and developing larger social structures, end quote. So I'd love to start with you, Joanna, and think about this role of soda brands to pop culture. You've thought about this for some time. Pepsi obviously being a title sponsor for the Super Bowl halftime show. How is branding, advertising, paid partnerships central to this spectacle? Especially, we've been having this conversation today, situated in late stage capitalism. What does this mean for you, these brand partnerships attached to this 15-minute concert between two halves of football?
Yeah, and I have to say, late stage capitalism is is the answer to a lot of these questions. So the way that U.S. media works has always worked, right, has been reliant on sponsorship. So that was true with radio, it's true with television. Um, you know, when the NFL was kind of consolidating itself, and Pete Rozelle in the early 60s, he wanted to make football the number one sport to beat baseball, right? The first thing he was looking at is to solidify a television broadcasting contract. And again, television broadcasting is paid for by advertising. So advertising has always had a natural role in both the NFL and television, and the way that these brands, of course, have integrated into all of the parts of the Super Bowl. It's a longer, more complicated story, but it's always really been key to making the Super Bowl work. Well, first making the NFL work on television, and then making the Super Bowl work as a monocultural event.
Absolutely. And much of our own kind of work has been informed by your scholarship and your introduction of this concept of co-branded spectacles, right? A term that speaks to this kind of entangled relationship between the Super Bowl halftime show, the championship game, all these performances around it, pregame national anthems, perhaps the most iconic being Whitney Houston. But more recently, we even see this incorporation of Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black national anthem, which began in 2020 as part of the NFL's quote unquote public commitment to broader social justice concerns following the death of George Floyd and amid the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and related social justice mobilities. For you, I'm thinking about these co-branded spectacles and what's at play here between the NFL, sponsors, and even these performers activated even around the game itself. What does this look like for you in this current landscape?
That's a great and huge question, which I appreciate. I've been using the lens of, of media theorists, people like Stuart Hall, talking about the circuit of culture, right? The points of articulation where meaning happens, and pairing that with work by Doug Kellner and some other folks on spectacle, right? When I started thinking about this project back in 2015, I started thinking about it in 2012 when I watched Madonna's halftime show. And I love those ruptures historically and musically where folks kind of don't get it, right? And we have some sort of backlash or people don't like what's going on. And so when I started to think through it, I was realizing that the way that these things come together and start to create conflict is the points where they don't meet the same kind of articulated meanings, right? And so you have the kind of spectacle of the Super Bowl itself and the things that it's selling, right? Which is, Americanness, patriotism, masculinity, all of these things that tie together in very complicated ways, right? And then you have the artists themselves on the field. And we know, again, from media theory and also music theory, musicologists and the musicologists have been theorizing this for a long time, that musicians are brands in themselves, right? And so you start to have these competing spectacles, and the reason why they're jarring is they're happening in the same space, right? In the same mediated space, and also on the same field, if it's a commercial or national anthem. So spectacle is interesting in so many ways because it both conceals sometimes things that are going on, but it also illuminates them. And what I always find interesting, of course, like being a musicologist, I'm very interested in reception history and how people receive things, and meaning is always fluid and it's always dependent on the user and the experiences and of course the artist as well, right? But those points of spectacle and meaning only communicate something where the audience is able to kind of grasp onto it. So when the audience can't grasp it, that's where you have those interesting points of friction and backlash.
Yeah, we have these moments. I'm thinking about even with the kind of inclusion of Lift Every Voice and Sing, where people are like, what song is this? Who is this for? Why is there a Black national anthem? These questions that start to circulate where there's that Stuart Hall encoding, decoding happening in terms of what we see in a performance versus how it spills out. And then thinking about this from your perspective as a communication scholar, Perry, I'm interested in this idea of how spectacle, in terms of thinking about how sport and entertainment are converging, what this kind of highly visible battleground is about. As you mentioned, Joanna, this idea, American ideals, injustices, cultural ideologies are constantly performed, negotiated, contested in this space. And so thinking about this most watched sporting event in the US every year, there's also this form of excess that it takes, whether it's the amount of food that we're eating while we're watching it, but also the commercials, but also all these things that are baked in that are also telling us something. And so I'm interested, Perry, from your perspective, how does this stage both kind of reify certain ideologies, but also create space for resistance? Is there any room beside all those logos we see that are kind of cluttering these spaces? Is there any room, anything that's possible there for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much a both and for all the reasons that you've identified, and actually that many of the panels this morning and this afternoon have been talking through, right? Of these institutions, these ideas are never separate, right? They are always, have always been entangled, and that's necessary in the way that they function as part of a broader society, right? And as functioning as part of a broader society, they are informed by sort of dominant ideologies, right? What are the values or beliefs that are most dominant, never the only ones, but right, sort of most mainstreamed, have the greatest sort of cultural, political, social currency in a moment that then are foregrounded in particular ways on this stage. I mean, Stuart Hall, again, hugely informative. Michael Reel, as you mentioned, hugely informative. And Michael Reel says that, right, the Super Bowl is America's greatest celebration of itself, right? And this idea of it being a celebration of itself, right, is not just sort of thinking about the sort of ethnocentrism, the supremacy that is built into this particular spectacle, but the way that the elements that are coordinated and curated throughout it, from the national anthem to the military flyovers, right, to the game itself, are deeply entangled and embedded with those larger structures of power that are always at play. And of course, right, there are moments for subversion or resistance, or we'll think through that together. But that's true of popular culture more broadly, right? Popular culture, even if it is mainstream, even if it is representative of this sort of like top 40 MO, is always also an opportunity for subversion and resistance, in part because those codes that are infused, right, incorporated and scripted in different forms of popular culture, are not always decoded, or not always decoded in the same ways, right? And that sort of friction of translation, of legibility, of audibility also creates opportunities for pushing against what might seem as like a very mainstream dominant reinscription of America or Americanness or some of these other ideologies that are at play. And then lastly, I'll just sort of say, right, the incorporation of music in this space is a part of this broader spectacle, right? Idea of it being in excess of everything, of branding, of consumption, right? Even for those of us, most of whom are never actually in the Super Bowl stadiums where this is taking place, right? We're at home, we're on our couch, we're on somebody else's couch, and consumption is very much a part of that. What are we eating? What are we drinking? What are we doing around it? So we have our own forms of sort of ancillary participation, right? And are we buying Pepsi? Are we buying Budweiser? Are we buying, right? That's why these commercials cost so much money, because of this idea of a captive audience. And so it is so rich. There's so much here that we could talk about, but I'll bracket there so that we can move forward in some of this.
Yeah. I mean, I think for us, even in putting this panel together, we thought about the various ways of how we kind of have to experience these things. We continue to return to them on YouTube and other spaces and documentaries. So it's not just about what happens in the stadium, but it's also about the reverberations, the ways we return to it, which is also makes it such a valuable media property as well. So I just thought it'd be cool to look at a few examples. We couldn't talk about this stage without watching together. We can't do something about music without taking some of that in. So we're going to sit on the kind of a virtual sofa here together. Let's crowd in, let's pass the chips around, and allow me to set the scene for a second. It's 2017, 2 weeks after the first inauguration of Donald Trump as president of the United States, and we have Lady Gaga performing as the headliner for Super Bowl 51's halftime show in Houston, Texas. It's a politically charged moment marked by renewed questions about America and American national identity, and in a state at the center of ongoing debates about border protections and immigration. There's all these headlines and think pieces, as we always have leading up to the halftime show, these prop bets, these questions about what's going to happen. And a lot of people had this anticipation of what could be a more radical performance, one that would speak directly to or out against the platforms and policies of the new administration, from a pop star who has never been one to shy away from voicing her stance on contemporary cultural and political issues. So now what I think I'll do is just play a little snippet from the very beginning of that halftime show.
National Football League welcomes you to the Pepsi Zero Sugar Super Bowl 51 halftime show.
God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. This land is your land. This land is my land. This land was made for you and me. One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, so here we have God Bless America blending into a rendition of folk singer Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land before concluding with an interlude from the Pledge of Allegiance, all the while being surrounded by 300 Intel drones arranged to form an image of the American flag behind her. I'll start here with Joanna. How are we to make sense of this performance, seemingly straddling maybe resistance, conformity? Is it radical? Is it subversive? How is this read as resistance? Or maybe just reification of the nation through this little medley, this ditty that is joining all these things together?
Sure. So, great question. So first, it's always like a contextual thing, right? So this is the introduction to the rest of the show, right? And so if you look at the pieces she chooses for the rest of the show and you contextualize it with this, it is, I don't know if subversive is the word, but it is kind of pushing back on these kind of new conservative ideals by first starting with them, right? But being very selective in the parts of This Land Is Your Land, right? Stand beside her and guide her, right? And then that part of the Pledge of Allegiance, it's very much about, you know, us together, right? Being united. So then she launches into Poker Face, which is a song about actually, you know, craving a woman, but tricking a man into thinking that she's into him, right? And then there's Born This Way, which is obviously an LGBTQ plus anthem, right? Don't be a drag, just be a queen. Doesn't matter if you're, you know, gay, straight, or bi, black or beige, right? All of these things. And then something that she does that Shakira does as well, and some of the other artists, she always is really careful to assert herself as a musician and a songwriter. So the fact that she picks up her guitar and is very deliberate about having somebody hold the microphone, and she's showing, you know, her prowess, and then later she sits down at the piano, right, to do a million ways or million reasons, that's the word. And so she's really asserting that you know, female vocalists have always been perceived as singing somebody else's songs and being a voice for somebody else and not having talent and not being the composers and being the body and not the mind, right? And so she's doing it all, right? But she's doing it in the Gaga way. The Gaga way is over the top spectacle. This is a person who wore meat, right? And so of course we're gonna have the drones there saying like, yes, I think she is sincere. She does believe in America. She invokes God a lot. She is, you know, religious in some form. And I think she is being sincere, but she's saying, yes, this is America, but we are America, right? And so the way that she does it isn't an obvious gesture in the way that I love Sarah that's amazing. You were at the Super Bowl, that you saw children in the cages, right? That J-Lo does. It's not in that way, but it still is very, again, I'm not sure that the word is subversive as much of just asserting, no, we are here and I am part of this much bigger we.
Yeah, I like the idea of assertive, right? Like what's being asserted in that moment. What about for you, Perry? What's the kind of potentials and limitations of this? What's happening up top? I also think about this geographically, like what's happening above the stadium versus when she, kind of spirals down and begins like, this is what's happening here, what's happening on the ground, right? What happens for you here? How is that kind of wrapped up in the role and constraints that we kind of put on mainstream artists as well?
Yeah, I mean, first, I would echo everything that Joanna said. I think you're right on in terms of the way that there is coding that is happening here, that is thoughtful, that is intentional, right? That is connected to these larger sort of political stances, roles in activism, right? She's very savvy in terms of the selections of each portion of the song that she's selecting just for this opening, not to mention the rest of the set itself, and then the way that that's woven together, right? And we could dissect each of those song choices, and that would be its own panel. But I think it's really interesting because trying to understand the way that this is mobilized in the context of the moment and in the context of this stage adds layers that we have to think about. As this sort of like America's biggest stage, right? The most highly visible, highly watched single American sporting event, single American event annually, right? There is a lot that is kind of at stake here, even if it is an opportunity to be more perhaps assertively subversive. And we will, time permitting, hopefully get to J-Lo and Shakira, right? To think through different activations of using this stage or taking advantage of the platform that this stage affords to be in conversation with what is happening, not just in the stadium itself, but in the surroundings, thinking here about Texas too. I know, in our work, we often refer to an article written by NPR lead music critic Ann Powers, who's thought extensively across popular culture spaces, but music specifically. And she wrote a piece in the wake of this performance. It was entitled essentially, "Should We Expect Pop Stars to Lead the Resistance?" And I was thinking about this morning, especially listening to our first panel and thinking about athletes and athlete activists and what it means for these figures who have platforms, figures who have resources, broadly defined, right? Of not just what do they do with that, but what are our expectations as fans, as audiences, on how they will use that and whether they should, right? And I think this is a standing conversation that is not new to this moment, but gets reactivated in moments of sort of broader cultural tension of how celebrities, public figures, whether they're athletes, whether they're pop stars, should be using these platforms. And in that piece, she was sort of thoughtful, and I would put it in conversation with Joanna's points and our own observations of this, of like this piece it is coded, but it is also safe, right? It is not so assertive in such a way that it is going to offend broad swaths of predominantly American audiences, many of whom subscribe to this idea of sort of like family-friendly, all-American entertainment. And so, this is a performance where we could read into it all of the things that Joanna outlined, while at the same time, it being a piece where you have the Pledge of Allegiance, where you have Intel drones comprising the American flag. And so, she refers to the fact that like Ivanka Trump and Marco Rubio were very celebratory about this performance. And so what do we do with that ambivalence when the coding is there, but it's also not easily deciphered? And if it's not easily deciphered, has it then done the work that perhaps it was intended to do? Because if those of us who can read into those codes are folks who are already sort of hip to a particular framing or alignment or allegiance, is it actually doing the work to move the sort of broader cultural, social, political needle at all if those who perhaps it needs to move a bit more are not being moved by it because they're just taking the pieces out of it that read America in a particular kind of way?
Yeah, and just to add a little more context, the year before that, if you recall, 2016, it was Coldplay's show, but most people don't remember it that way. Most of it remember this particular show in 2016 by the two guests that eventually joined, Bruno Mars and of course, Beyonce. And we have Beyonce's first public performance of Formation, which the video had dropped the day before as the first commercial single off the visual album that would later be known as Lemonade. And she timed this up with the simultaneous launch of her next global tour. And a lot was made of this moment, the ensemble, the clothes, the songs, the lyrics. And so it really brings this question, if we think about this assertive versus subversive, I really like that framing because this idea of what's considered political art versus activism versus this term artivism, I'm interested in this idea of how we make sense of the ways folks want to be considered making a statement. What is that statement? How is this maybe a nod to Michael Jackson? Some felt this was a nod to the Black Panthers. All these things are conversations people are having in this encoding, decoding, the idea of these battlegrounds on which refusal and resistance has been enacted and catalyzed. And so I want to think about that together, and maybe just for the sake of time, jump ahead a little bit to think about how this branding kind of with this idea of asserting oneself, asserting one's brand, becomes this idea of refusal and resistance kind of happening here. In 2018, we stay with the Knowles Carter family here, we have an era marked by refusal. And we have this line, for example, from Jay-Z about turning down the Super Bowl halftime show in the Carter's Ape Shit, right? I said no to the Super Bowl, right? And a variety of other performers that are creating this quote unquote artistic picket line around the halftime show. So it's not just about what you do. If we think about Beyonce and Lady Gaga, right? It's about what you choose not to do, right? And your reasoning for doing so. For Jay-Z, it's about creative control. And then for Cardi B and Rihanna in particular, it's about this idea of solidarity with Colin Kaepernick and what that means in this moment. But these things become cyclical, right? We know that for sure. By 2019, we see another shift, Roc Nation coming on board in partnership with the NFL just that quickly. We go from I said no to the Super Bowl to this very intricate, very tied branding relationship. And so I'm interested when we think about the brand of the artists themselves in that moment, how either one of you, if you want to hop in, think about this idea of asserting one's brand, asserting oneself in both either activating a partnership or the idea of refusal.
Sure, I'll jump in. It's so, I mean, these shifts, we could criticize them. We can be like, that was a quick turnaround, but I think it's so much more complicated than that, in part because of the demands and the constraints, particularly of late stage capitalism, of like, there's a lot at stake here, right? And these are also savvy, especially with the Knowles Carter family, like savvy business movers who, in a way, if we think about that lyric, like I said no to the Super Bowl, you need me, I don't need you. In some ways, that partnership has shifted here. Jay-Z's not on the stage at halftime, not getting paid, because Super Bowl halftime performers do not get paid, right? But he is partnering to have creative control and ownership to an extent in terms of having this Roc Nation NFL partnership. And so there's a leverage power move that's happening here where even if it's not the same play of refusal, it's a renegotiation of what that dynamic of power looks like, while still being rooted in late stage capitalism, because that's the structure, the political economy that we are operating within, right? And so again, I think to this question of like, what are the expectations? Is it subvertive? Are you being a sellout? I think it's way more complicated than that. And it's like, but there are movements that are being made here that are thinking through those very constraints to think about both what are the limitations, but also how do you leverage them in a way that can change the relationship? And refusal is often a part of that negotiation, even if refusal is not something that continues through all stages of negotiation. So I'll stop there. And Joanna, if you've got that.
Exactly, Perry. And yes, the late stage capitalism is is the key here, right? So after Beyonce's 2016 the second performance, right? DeRay McKesson, who was a BLM, still is a BLM leader, tweeted, at its core, she is reminding us that economic justice is a key component to liberation work, right? So this idea that you have to, and this has gone, we've talked about this in other panels too, you have to be in a position of power for something this large to make change, right? And so, as Perry said, this is much more complicated. It's not a, always just a like, oh, we should or we shouldn't. Having creative control is a massive endeavor, right? For this section of the game that Nielsen ratings show that people tune in just for this part. They also show that after the halftime show, going into the third quarter, all of the ratings fall, right? So you're actually in control of millions of global eyeballs, right? And so no matter if you're a performer or you're Jay-Z's Roc Nation, right, having those eyes on you regardless is an important thing, and something that I think we kind of gestured at, but we haven't said explicitly if you are a woman, and especially if you are a Black woman, and if you are a Black woman that is also, LGBTQIA plus in any form, and on and on and on, all the elements of intersectionality, you are going to be judged more harshly, right? And again, the FCC complaints show it, right? And that's something Courtney and Perry and I have talked about, is those complaints come in about women way more than they come in about men, even Black men. So you add those layers to it, and honestly, like somebody like Rihanna or Beyonce, all of those levels of intersectionality, just being on the Super Bowl field to do your thing, no matter what, how obvious, right, your activism is or isn't, is a really big deal, because your body being there and taking control of a masculine field, a field where women are not allowed on, right, at any other point in that game, is a really big deal.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. That kind of brings us beautifully to the very first Roc Nation produced show, the 2020 Super Bowl halftime show starring Jennifer Lopez and Shakira as co-headliners. And the duo's electrifying performance showcased their many hits, the range of talent. You brought up Shakira, she plays drums. Thinking about grappling with the consequences of some of those political interventions first promised during Trump's 2016 campaign. And then we also have the intervention of Netflix jumping in, kind of creating a new kind of way of reframing these shows. The documentary Halftime captures the show's development behind the scenes and places it within Lopez's larger career trajectory. And just again, thinking about creative control, self-branding, and how one asserts. And so I want to give a couple of contextual kind of clips from the documentary, as well as a little bit of the show, to kind of think through some of the things that even folks are already tapped into in the chat here, just to kind of honor that. So here's the first kind of clip about how this all comes to be.
I'm not into politics. I'm not that person, but I was living in a United States that I didn't recognize. I was afraid for my kids, for their future.
Build that wall! Build that wall! Build that wall! No water wall!
This wall is just another way for him to try to divide the country.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
This is a flat-out invasion.
Inside this old warehouse, the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol is keeping hundreds of immigrant children in cages created by metal fencing.
The cages, the image of the cages for me, like I couldn't believe what I was watching.
Every adult who comes into the country illegally is sent to see a judge for possible prosecution. And that is when the parent is separated from the child.
You don't rip a child from their parents. There's just certain things as a human being you don't do. What is my message? And what do I stand for? It made me realize that I have a responsibility to not be quiet, to not just leave the politics to everybody else. This year's Super Bowl halftime show is a statement to a divided country, declaring the importance of kindness, inclusivity, and compassion, a reminder that we're always stronger, always better together. Shakira and Jennifer together for the first time in Miami to craft a powerhouse performance that does just that. I told her to start thinking about what she wants that last song to be. She wasn't crazy about Born in the USA. I'm not 100% convinced, so I couldn't convince her. She's like, I wasn't born in the US. I said, yeah, but everybody loves to sing that song. And when America is at its best, everybody wants to live in America.
You also have the right to come here because we're a country of immigrants. That's who we are.
Bruce Springsteen, white American, saying to me, she was born in the, and I was, and I'm Latin. That's big. That's big. Because these motherfuckers act like everybody's an immigrant who's trying to sneak into the country and who's a criminal. Because that's the narrative that Trump created, which is bullshit. Some of us have been here for years, and a lot of those people are just good people who are looking for the American dream. That's all they want. But like I told her, I said, if you come up with a better song and a better cameo to make the statement that we shouldn't be hating on each other,
the statement's right.
That's the statement. That's the statement.
So I'm interested to hear from y'all. This notion of an America she doesn't recognize is really fascinating to me. I'm wondering how there's a diagnosis here, perhaps, of the cultural political amnesia required to make a statement like that. But also the idea of not being political, but I have to do something in this moment. And so thinking about, again, we've been talking about this all day in the symposium, about the stage, the setting, the opportunity. But hearing from someone like J-Lo and her approach, as well as Shakira's kind of response and clap back to invoking a Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, in terms of song selection, approach, and that kind of relationship, we kind of see behind the scenes, the sausage being made here. What do you make of how J-Lo is assessing the show in this idea of America and Americanness that we kind of started with Michael Reel? Perry, do you have kind of any kind of perspective in terms of how the Super Bowl in 2020 is kind of framed by J-Lo and her crew?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, I don't want to criticize J-Lo, but I think this idea of not being political is an articulation that comes from one conceptualization of what it means to be political, right? It's using a definition that I think is more limited to thinking about politics in terms of partisanship, in terms of political parties, in terms of being affiliated with campaigns or campaign or administration politics in a particular kind of way, which for sure is a part of this larger conversation of politics. But you know, as we started this conversation, right, it's always has always been and necessarily been political, right? In all the ways at every single level. But I also think what this indicates is a larger sort of conceptualization of the way that media, that sort of dominant conceptualizations in America like to frame politics as separate from entertainment. Politics is separate from sports, right? This idea of get off, you know, shut up and dribble, right? That we hear in different sporting spaces. And I think in many cases, pop stars in particular get that same messaging from the media. They get that same messaging from partnerships and advertisers. They get that same messaging from labels because it's seen as a risk. It's seen as an economic risk, right? To be political is to take a stance that may not be agreeable to a mainstream American audience. And if you want to move and mobilize the money of a mainstream American audience, then you need to appease those who may not want to hear your political ideas, right? And so I think that that's something that it's not necessarily a misconceptualization of J-Lo here, but it's indicative of the way that this separation of entertainment, broadly defined film, TV, sports, etc., has been separated from this sort of old school conservative idea of what politics means in a way that is, you know, for lots of reasons, complicated and always inaccurate, but it's one that's pushed as a message. And it's one that is pushed as a message, to Joanna's earlier point, particularly to women, of like, be the nice girl, right? Smile and nod, be the nice girl. And so I think that there's an institutionalization of that has happened by virtue of being in an industry that is so deeply entangled with these things and yet loves to pretend over and over again that it is not.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting point about creative control. I'd like to play this one clip here, and I'll maybe hear from Joanna on the other side of this, of what it means for these performers who are trying to think through creative control in a particular way. When the NFL and Pepsi and all these Rock Nation, all these different brands are also attaching themselves in a particular way. Let's watch this one.
We left rehearsal, and I noticed everybody's kind of freaking out, but I don't know why. And I get a call from Benny, and he's like, they want to pull the cages. And that night, the higher ups at the NFL saw it for the first time, and they're like, hey, you can't do that.
The NFL had a real concern about making a political statement about immigration. They looked at the plans, and the message was absolute. They did not want those cages in the show. That had come down from the highest authority. Highest authority.
For me, this isn't about politics. This is about human rights. I'm facing the biggest crossroads of my life, you know, to be able to perform on the world's biggest stage, but to take out the cages and sacrifice what I believe in would be like never being there at all. There was a part of me that just got very zen, and I was just like, Benny, I don't care what you have to do. We're not changing the show. The Super Bowl is tomorrow, and we're not changing anything.
So here we have a really defiant J-Lo in a way that may be surprising to folks, may not be. But Joanna, for you, when you hear this idea, and again, politics, this is not about politics, this is about human rights. Again, like one of the most political terms that we have today. I'm interested for you, what is this kind of creative control and this idea? I love what she says here about if I pull this, it's like not being there at all. What does that mean for you?
Yeah, so first of all, echoing everything Perry said, right? And there are these really kind of rigid definitions of what, politics are, and this idea that political entertaining bodies, right? Especially, Black entertainers were very vocal about this at the turn of the 20th century, right? The fact that both sports and any kind of music, whatever entertainment, that you are supposed to just get up there and do your thing and somehow not be expressing any sense of yourself, but your body is political, right? All of our bodies are political, our experiences are political, the way we talk, the way the musical choices, right? That J-Lo makes here. So, the way that she kind of beautifully weaves Born in the USA, which is actually a dystopian song, which the, Reagan's crew famously misread, right? For his campaign, right? And they had to kind of take that off the campaign trail because Bruce Springsteen said, maybe listen to the lyrics, man. But you have this moment where she's doing this double meaning with it, where she's asserting I'm born in the USA, but things aren't perfect. I'm also from Puerto Rico, which is a territory, right? My family's from there, and the way that the USA treats its territories and treats its immigrants, right? We have all of these things happening, and she moves into Let's Get Loud, which is her statement, right? So she's saying, women are often reduced to their bodies and their voices, but that's what we have. And she says Latinas, right? So she literally like calls on everybody, including the children, her own daughter around her, right? So it's this really beautiful musical moment that has so many layers of meaning. And of course the flag itself that she has on herself. But for an artist, right? Just generally, when you're rehearsing, something especially like this where you have literally hundreds of people that you're relying on, plus the lighting, plus the engineers, plus blah 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 blah, right? Changing one mark throws off the whole show. So it's also, of course, it's a values thing in terms of what she believes, but it's also a disaster thing. It would be a disaster to restage that entire field by pulling that number. I think it's on both sides, right? Both as a professional artist and her message. She says this is the key to her message, and the fact that they put it at the end, they could have buried it in lots of places, but they didn't. It's really, really powerful.
All right, so with that amazing introduction, I want to briefly show the segment the NFL didn't want you to see from the Lopez Shakira halftime show.
If you wanna live your life, live it all the way and don't you waste it. Every feeling, every beat can be so very sweet, you gotta taste it. Let's get loud, let's get loud. Turn the music up, let's do it. Come on people, let's get loud. Let's get loud. Latinos! Born in the USA. Let's get loud. Ladies, let's get loud. 'Cause I wanna get my mind. Let's get loud. Ain't nobody gotta tell you what you gotta do. No, no. Everybody over here, let's get right here. Let's get.
All right, so here we have a lot happening for sure. But as mentioned, we have this kind of different kind of medley that's happening, that's bringing these things together. The costuming, Puerto Rican flag on one side, US flag, invocation of the flag is moving all through these performances for sure. But one of the things that was already mentioned, I think is really important is there's this political statement that the NFL is worried about, but instead there's over 1,000 FCC complaints filed. And Perry and I in our free time love going through FCC complaints. This kind of started with the Justin Janet moment for us, but it's just every year we're just curious, what are people saying? What are people upset about? And while the NFL was worried about a political statement involving immigration, the biggest complaints were about these women that were mothers and how they were dressed, the choreography, how they're dancing. And it was about their bodies. They are proven right here in this moment of what people are so hyper focused about is about maintaining this kind of white Christian Puritan US kind of identity and ideology. Again, to quote Real as Perry did, this idea of America tells on itself. This is the story that it likes to tell about itself. And the responses to it, the way people decode this and recode this in different ways, also becomes a part of this. So I'm interested in how this kind of shapes our understanding about nation, about what's quote unquote family friendly, as Perry mentioned, for both of you. Perry, how do you read this moment in terms of also the audience response to this particular portion and the show in general?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of telling on ourselves becomes very transparent in these moments, FCC complaints in particular, but they're so interesting. I mean, if no one, folks on the webinar here haven't, I invite you to. They are publicly available. They're anonymous in the sense you don't know who's submitting them, but you do know where they've been submitted. So you get this interesting geographical map of the United States too, of sort of like where particular understandings or readings of media trend in particular ways, which generally sort of map onto what we might consider in terms of geographical orientations. But I think that this idea of bodies being central and bodies being political is so crucial. And it's also so rooted in these longer histories, right? That each year now, it's like we can sort of, it's like gamify it of let's predict what the issue is going to be that is most vocal in the FCC complaints. And for women over and over and over again, it is the presentation of body. And for J-Lo and Shakira, it was not just the outfits that they chose to wear, but it was the fact that they chose to wear them as mothers, right? This sort of invoking of maternity is a different kind of threshold that the ideal American woman is supposed to maintain and not transgress after you have had a child, which was interesting. But I also think it's to the NFL sphere, it reiterates this commentary that you're talking about. And we can look back to Beyonce in 2016 as well, right? Of the black leather, this homage to the Black Panther Party, this perhaps homage to Michael Jackson and his performance in 1993, where he had that sort of the crossover front. But people also thought that it was an invocation of BDSM. And there was this reading of it being this sort of transgressive sexual presentation of black leather or black leather bodice and metallics on the body. And so there's these histories rooted in sexism, rooted in racism, get read and mapped and projected onto bodies in a way that in many cases makes the case for these artists for what they're standing up for. But I just sort of will pivot momentarily to think about the children, right? Of having children participate, not only J-Lo's own daughter, who you see singing in the beginning of that clip, all of the dancers here, right, have bedazzled American flags on their little crop hoodies, right? So America is ever present, including with the flag. But children have been invoked as part of the halftime show in different moments, notably in 1991. So that same Super Bowl that gives us Whitney Houston's iconic national anthem performance, it was New Kids on the Block and 3,000 children. And those children that were part of that show were largely part of a curated attempt to think about this idea of being family friendly, being all-American in a moment when the United States is entering Desert Storm and the Gulf War. And many of those children were the children of enlisted members overseas. And it becomes this different presentation of what's at stake. We have to protect the children, right? And so in 1991, it's protecting the sort of all-American brand child. Here, J-Lo's thinking about children globally, thinking about children as human rights, thinking about her own child, thinking about children in cages. And yet what we focus on is that their bodice was too short, too tight for mothers who are over 40.
Yeah, Joanna, for you, what do you kind of see in this moment with performance, with branding, and the ideas of the nation that are baked into this performance?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, like you could pull at these threads forever, right? There's so much coding and encoding in this, and in all musical performances, I mean, that's what makes at art, right? And I'm also reminded, so if when you look at FCC complaints, if you look at Rihanna's, right? So like she could not have been more clothed. And there were still people that said it looks like she's wearing a red bra, right? Like they're like women just can't win in this space, right? And is it really about the bra, or is it about the fact that she's pregnant, right? Like, and so again, thinking about motherhood and who's allowed on the field, and those moments of branding. Now, of course, this is the year past the Pepsi moments, right? But for both, oh no, this is no, not yet, right? This is still Pepsi moments, so it works because it's red, white, and blue, which is also Pepsi's colors. When we get to Apple Music, also works, the red and the white, right? And so there's ways that branding can be neatly tied in, but we don't see it as much in this show as we do see in some of the other shows by like The Weeknd, or even Dr. Dre's massive hip hop show. We see a little bit more of that. But yeah, it really does come down to the body, but also there's a lot of sonic things going on. Like she ends with a salsa song. She doesn't end with an American top 40, piece, which she could have, because she had a lot of them, but she sang those earlier, right? And so did Shakira, right? In my opinion, of all the halftime shows, this is the most cohesive in terms of like being all, Latin American folks showing diaspora in Miami of all places, right? But that unfortunately is not how people read it.
Absolutely. Before we get out of here, I would absolutely have an incomplete discussion with y'all without looking at this year's performance. And we can think about the announcement of Kendrick Lamar as the headliner for the halftime show, with both the ways people were disappointed, wanting to think about local performers. And I know the three of us have watched through all of these halftime shows. We typically see New Orleans has hosted a lot of Super Bowl halftime shows. They often do invoke the local. They invoke the history of jazz, for example. They situate local artists, and we have that a bit in the pre kind of game musical selections for sure. But for many people, they felt that selection of Kendrick Lamar, driven by the popularity of his ever-present beef with Drake, as well as his many Grammy nominations, was a telling choice in terms of pop culture, of relevance, of the NFL being able to attach itself to a relevant pop culture moment. And as folks may remember, Kendrick Lamar had already performed at SoFi Stadium for Super Bowl 56 in 2019. You mentioned the Dr. Dre and Friends show. But I want to think about the idea of an America divided. And we see that in the show, and the use of flags, people as flags, and kind of creating and breaking down the American flag as part of that. There's this moment of rupture that once again is happening both on the US and on the global political stage, but we have this corporate, commodified, highly visible stage, once again, with different sets of expectations that, as you two mentioned, are informed by race and gender in a particular kind of way. I want to quickly kind of note that not only is this Kendrick Lamar, he's joined by SZA, Mustard, and Uncle Samuel L. Jackson in this kind of role that again is invoking the nation in a different kind of way, offering a critique of an industry and a society obsessed with and disgusted with Black cultural forms, addressing this idea of Blackness as pathology, and disrupting the expectation of the mini concert with both its setup and execution. There's a lot of moment of great anticipation leading up to this. I'm interested just to hear from you both. This show garnered a lot of attention, a lot of hot takes, lots of op-eds. What did you think of this show and how it lined up with the lineage of the Super Bowl halftime shows, and this idea of reading resistance through this particular show? Whether people were reading into this messaging, Kendrick Lamar gets a lot of deep reads from folks, or the fact that people just wanted the Celine jeans that he had on, which is his own kind of branding mechanism there too. There's a tour to sell, Kendrick Lamar and SZA going on tour together. All the pieces we've talked about are kind of coagulating here for me. So I'll start here with Carrie. What did the show represent for you in thinking about this idea of space and place, as well as branding and resistance?
Yeah. Oh, there's so much I could say. I love this show. To me, when we think about this assertive versus subversive readings of intentions of messaging, of coding, this felt much more assertive, but also very clear in terms of the vision and the message that he wanted to be like the artist is present here in the conceptualization of all of this. So is the tactician. right? The ability to weave together in, Super Bowls are at most 14 minutes, somewhere between 13 and 14 minutes historically. Like that's it, even for J-Lo and Shakira, who as co-headliners are splitting that. I think the ability to articulate and to present that with so many layers was very beautifully, very effectively executed here, which is in part why people are still thinking about this one. It's lingering in a way that others in the past, I think, have not lingered to the same extent. Or you sort of have these, especially with the rise of social media, like just the cumulative content that is dedicated to breaking down and unpacking this and the messaging there. I think Kendrick is also very smart in his ability to play with history, to play with these sort of stereotypes and tropes, and with the idea of Uncle Sam and sort of, right, even though some people were mad of like, Uncle Sam is white, but it's like, well, you weren't listening to what's happening here, because part of that is the point, to create a moment of dissonance in order to present a critique of a cultural moment and a larger cultural history that sort of invokes and pulls that forward. So I could say so much on this. I think I want to bracket. But the other thing I'll say is like that idea of late stage capitalism is still very present in terms of launching the tour and sort of the idea to bring SZA on. I don't know at what point, if that was always part of the plan or if that became part of the plan and as a smart marketing strategic move with the launch of the GNX tour, but also this idea of sort of modification. For those that watched the Super Bowl halftime show during SZA's performance, there was supposed to be pyrotechnics in some capacity that had to be sort of eliminated in real time when President Trump decided that he wanted to be in the stadium, right? So this sort of like the political infusion is present on the stage, in the stadium. And I love being able to teach my pop culture and music classes in the spring, precisely because we get to unpack this, and my students had so much to say on this one. So I'll pass it.
Yeah. So I'm interested, just because we kind of have this moment of thinking about the role of like the commodification that's obviously at play here with all of these things, the potential of making a statement, the president being there, as we're also having the rollback of all those 2020 provisions we discussed, right? Where we've lost in racism in the end zone, right? The president's going to be here. So we have this moment of rupture that's happening across the league, as well as within this performance, the idea of cultural kind of vulture moments that are happening, what Kendrick is critiquing, pending lawsuits, so much baked into this entire thing. So I'm really interested from thinking about this perspective and this idea of the multiple readings that people have. What happens, especially in moments where other flags are brought in. And if you're not familiar, as TV cameras were trying to steer away from this, we have a moment during this show where a joint Sudanese and Palestinian flag is raised by one of the background dancers, who's then chased around the field, which brings questions of the limits of the appropriate, which flags can be visible on this stage. So we have both this resistant moment where Kendrick Lamar can be consumed by industry, but we have this moment that's deemed too far outside the parameters of the acceptable in this space. I'd like for a second to allow Zulkanar Nantambo, who is the dancer that was brought out of that space, to think about what this means in terms of those limits. And then Joanna, I'll toss it to you.
I mean, we over here eating steaks, hummus, sleeping on big lofty pillows and beds, and you see images on your phone, widows, people walking miles on gravel, no shoes. How could I not? How could I not? And then wake up and pray and say I'm a Muslim.
By now, you've probably seen the footage. It's Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl halftime show, and just as the last song builds to a climax, a performer holds up the flags of Palestine and Sudan. We caught up with the performer Zulkarnain Nantambu, who staged that protest.
You know, people losing their loved ones, their children, so many janazas. I pray that their suffering is over, but while we going through it, we got to show that we with them.
How did the idea come about to unfurl the Sudanese and Palestinian flags while performing?
When we got into the Super Bowl, Superdome to practice, then I just started getting inspired on, man, hey, you're about to be a part of a big platform. Use this platform to highlight what your Muslim brothers and sisters around the world are going through. So when they called us out, I ran, jumped on the GNX, and then that gave me the height to unfurl the flag, and it could be seen, distinguished amongst all the other stuff that's going on. So it was like a platform to display it. They just saw somebody running around on the field. So they got a radio, oh, go get this guy. We ran across the field and, you know, they just gave him more camera time, more people to pick it up. And it was shown live. People that watched it live saw it. You know, they saw it in the corners. Like if you go to the NFL's YouTube channel, you can watch the performance. The flag is still up. Then if you recognize it, you represent it. And that is really for them, not other people.
As you know, President Trump was in the audience. He's been talking about wanting the U.S. to take over Gaza. What is your message to President Trump?
I pray that God changes his heart. For his sake and for America's sake, we got to do what's right because we don't want bad stuff to come upon us. My ancestors built this nation. I'm an American, true and true. The reason why I didn't need an American flag up there is because Kendrick handled that for me when they put the people in formation. I just added the flags that needed representation.
You upset all these powerful corporations, right? But you won the hearts and minds of so many people, and your following on Instagram has skyrocketed. So what do you think is the lesson in all of this?
The lesson is be on the right side of right. Do what's right. You know what I'm saying? At the end of the day, life is short. And we believe that what we do in this life determines where we'll go for eternity. And when you do it for the people, you always gonna be supported.
So here we have all the pieces coming together, right? The question of which flags can be there, the branding, corporate kind of connection, this idea of using the platform, using the stage. And so just to bring it all home, Joanna, what does this moment in particular in this performance mean for you?
So yeah, there's a lot going on. So this is an interesting moment, right? Because this is a global event, right? It's a fully global event that is always still meant to be an American export, right? And so this dancer has brought the global consciousness like onto the field, right? And it's this moment where when you look at kind of media theory and media culture and this kind of progression towards more kind of participant culture, right? And I mean, that's how social media works, right? It's by the people, right? This is a moment where the people start to take control of this kind of, again, this last monocultural event, this last appointment-based event where people, as we kind of opened with, right, we get together with our friends and our families and we turn it on. It is perhaps the only time, right, that still remains that we pay attention to this, and it's not for a few minutes, it's for hours, right? That doesn't of course mean we're not doing other things, but it's this really, again, back to late capitalism, right? It's this moment where the people start to take control of the things that have been very, very tightly controlled and heavily mediated. And you know, I was reading a little bit about this, and of course, Kendrick and his people say, I don't know what happened, right? And that makes me kind of think like, well, did Justin Timberlake also not know what's happening, right? We always have these questions, but this moment of taking control of a very heavily guarded, right, heavily inspected. We just saw J-Lo talk about the fact that the NFL was like, nope, get it off the field, right? And that has always been the case, right? That this person got it through. So that plus the intertextuality, just like as Perry, like this is, you're right, this is such a great discussion to have with our you know, our colleagues, but also our students. The intertextuality of this entire performance is incredible because Kendrick Lamar is first and foremost an artist. There's no way he was not going to do something that you know wasn't activist in some way or talking about being a Black man in America. And he drops little pieces here and there, and you can choose to pick up whichever ones you want, right? He does kind of as Samuel Jackson as his character kind of takes on Uncle Sam, he points, oh, you know, do you not know how to play the game? This is too loud, this is too black, right? Then moves into a pop song. Oh yeah, that's what America wants, right? And so he's playing with us, right, in this really intelligent and interesting way. And again, this particular dancer, he knows how to play the game, right? So we see it here.
Yeah, absolutely. We have this moment. I love when he says, Kendrick had the US flag covered. I was thinking about the other flags that needed to be represented. I love that line because we've been thinking about this kind of iconography of the flag as it's worn, as it's displayed, as it's lit up in all of these spaces. So I find that to be so helpful and so useful. Perry, before we get out of here, I want to think about what you think about Nantambu's kind of intervention in this space, how that's communicated, and what you think this kind of also signals to us in this idea of performance from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I would go back to, I think, my first comments when we started talking today of like that it is never apolitical, right? And there are always moments for subversion. This happens to be one that is more visible and more audible and that has these afterlives, right? But I think it also, and actually to invoke earlier panels to today and Chris Cluey's comments, right, of this idea of risk, of like what's actually at stake here versus what the move, this moment of direct action is invoking in terms of the stakes in Gaza, the stakes in Sudan, right? And so I think there's like a risk assessment that's part of activism, right? That's not just about are you using your platform, but about like what are the dynamics of power that are at play and how can you activate these moments that are, you know, we love to compartmentalize mainstream entertainment to then remind folks that like, no, they've never been just that. And this is a part of a much larger history. So back to the first panel today, like, will there be athlete activists? Absolutely. Like, absolutely, right? We not always in the same ways and not always in the same moments, but that's where the cultural amnesia, it's like we tend to forget sometimes. And it's like this, in some ways, this moment is a backlash to progress, right? And there will be another instantiation of this. And so pop culture to me is so rich as a site to interrogate this precisely because it's written off as not serious, right? It's not serious. J-Lo and Shakira, not serious, right? Beyonce, not serious. It's like, no. Like this actually is the moment and the place in which we play with and negotiate these things precisely because they are mainstream. So I think I'll stop there.
Well, that's fantastic. I think to kind of bring it all together, hopefully to bring this fantastic symposium together. I want to thank you both for giving all of this incredible insights, bringing musicology and media studies together. Always a fun treat for me to be in conversation with you both. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the Institute for having us. We're always happy to chat more, but we want to thank you and hand things back over to Andrew. Thank you so much.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Courtney and Perry and Joanna. I'm thinking about the fact that we're hosting this event from Nashville, from Music City. So it was appropriate to end with music. We've got about, 7 more months to wait for the next Super Bowl, but we'll be watching with a lot more interest of the halftime show. I'll have to get in touch with you guys for your analysis of the next halftime show. I want to thank all of the other hosts and panelists for the incredible job that they did today. Thank you, Dr. Shepard and Elisa here at the James Lawson Institute for hosting us today, and to our amazing intern, Hannah Schwartz, who has stepped in to handle all the technology today on her day off. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We'll be back next year with our 3rd annual symposium. In the meantime, if you're interested in learning more about the James Lawson Institute, you can find more information online on that. And then our Vanderbilt Sports and Society initiative, you can follow on Blue Sky and Twitter. And just email me if you'd like to be included on our weekly e-newsletter, in which Courtney Cox will be featured this week as the most recent guest on our podcast. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.